And now I'll share my screen. This is what I want to share. There we go. Okay. Move this over here. Okay, so it's good to see everybody this morning. Just wanted to say a couple things about the schedule coming up, and before I say the bracha, we get started today. So next Sunday, next 2 Sundays, there should be class, and then the 28th we will not have class. It's a Sunday during Passover, and then the 5th, the 12th, and 19th of May, we should have class, but then that will be it because it's Memorial Day weekend after that, and then so our classes are from Labor Day to Memorial Day. So we have then 5 more classes. So hopefully we won't be talking about the status of wine the whole time, but we had the Mishnah last week that described that gave some laws about various foods of Gentiles that either are permitted or not permitted to for Jews to consume. So Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we had a story last time here in this paragraph, Shmuel and Ablet, and whether the cooked wine was okay or not. And we talked about this whole process of cooked wine and why is it that cooked wine is okay for non-Jews to touch and Jews then to drink, whereas regular wine might not be okay to consume. So we continue. The Gemara cites yet another incident. Rabbi Chia's maidservant noticed that a certain container of cooked wine had become exposed. She came before Rabbi Chia, who said to her that the sages said cooked wine is not subject to the halacha of exposure. Now this is a bizarre kind of halacha. Water and other liquids that are meant to drink are not supposed to be left open. Because if they are left open, then you can't drink them because it's a matter of safety. For the rabbis, liquids that are exposed could mean that snakes or bugs or other dangerous things could go into that container, and then you might get injured or you might die. So whether it's a barrel, a vat, or a glass, you're not supposed to leave it exposed. So Rabbi Chia is saying, though, cooked wine isn't in that category of liquids that are subject to this law of exposure. So why that is, I'm not sure. Again, the whole idea of exposure, just look down here at the halacha, that later authorities, the Shulchan Aruch writes that since snakes are not commonly found nowadays, liquids that have been exposed are permitted. So these laws from the Mishnah and the Talmud about exposure don't, in the Middle Ages, the 1500s, when the Shulchan Aruch was published, by the 1500s, they're saying the law of exposure doesn't count anymore. So how much more so it doesn't count today. And so the idea behind exposure was about the fear of snakes getting inside. So cooked wine, even in the time of the rabbis, was not subject to the halacha of exposure. Similarly, Rav Ada bar Ahava's attendant noticed that a certain container of diluted wine had become exposed. Rav Ada bar Ahava said to him that the sages said diluted wine is not subject to the halacha of exposure. So cooked wine, and again, let me just in today's world, cooked wine means pasteurized. There are a number of wines that we buy, especially in the category of kosher wines, that will say on the label mevushal. So it'll say it in Hebrew letters. It might say it in English letters, the word mevushal. Mevushal is the word cooked, and when it comes to wine nowadays, that means pasteurized, and usually it's flash pasteurized. So it's there are some wine producers who claim that flash pasteurizing the wine doesn't harm the wine at all, doesn't affect the quality of the wine at all or the taste. And some people decide to do it for extra precautions against germs, bacteria, or whatnot. And it's the idea of pasteurized milk too. All milk that we buy today, except unless if you go to a dairy farm and get freshly milked cow milk, most milk that we buy today in supermarkets are pasteurized, and that's just for the sense of, hey,
What's the timing for the class? What is it?
9:30 to 10:30.
Okay, let's see if I can stay.
Okay, so so when it comes to wine, though, they add the status of cooked wine. Then the pasteurized wine means that it is enough to affect the status of wine to not make it wine anymore. So wine you're not allowed to leave out to be exposed. Wine would be subject to other laws related to non-Jews, but cooked wine then, because it's cooked, you're doing something different to the way wine is usually made, so then it's not subject to these laws, and specifically here, not subject to exposure. So Rav Papa said, and so diluted wine then also is a different status too, because in the rabbi's time, wine was a little bit more concentrated than wine that we buy today. So it would be common to mix that concentrate with some water to allow the wine to last longer. So that's not done today anymore, but apparently in ancient times that was common with wine, that you'd make it into this concentrate and then you'd be diluting it. And so also a question for the rabbis then would be, how diluted does the wine have to be for it not to be counted as wine anymore and be counted as some other kind of liquid? And it's a question also for the 4 cups of wine that we're supposed to drink at the Seder. So how diluted the wine is affects whether it's kosher or counts as cups of wine that we're supposed to drink at the Seder. Okay, so there'll be questions about whether cooked wine is allowed to be used for the 4 cups of wine. For us today, the question is whether grape juice can be used, wine can be used, and it doesn't matter whether it's mevushal or not mevushal. Okay, so the status of diluted wine is really not really a question anymore, because it's not something that you purchase. It's not something you do to wine anymore. Also, the question is, how much wine do you have to drink for each cup of wine to make of the 4 cups of wine to make it a kosher cup of wine. So there was a magazine that I used to get years ago called Kashrus magazine, and the Passover edition was thicker than all the other editions of Kashrus magazine during the year, because it would have the specific details of how big the piece of matzah has to be to fulfill the commandment of eating matzah at the Seder, when you say hamotzi on it, and then also the special bracha for eating matzah. How big of a piece of matzah do you have to have? And seriously, I remember they had a page in the middle of the Haggadah that you can put your matzah up against to measure it, to see how much. And they had different measurements dependent upon who your rabbi is. Are you following the Vilna Gaon? Are you following this rabbi? You're following that rabbi? And they had the different measurements on the page. So they had the same kind of thing about wine. How much wine do you have to drink for each cup of wine for it to count? Okay. So Rav Papa said, we said that wine is not subject to the halacha of exposure only in a case where it was well diluted. But where it was only partially diluted, a snake might still drink from it, and therefore it's prohibited. Right? So here, the case of diluted wine not subject to halacha of exposure, according to Rav Papa, it depends on how diluted it is. The Gemara rejects this claim, and is it correct that a snake drinks partially diluted wine? But wasn't Rabba bar Rav Huna once traveling on a ship while carrying a jug of wine with him, and he saw a certain snake that slithered and approached the wine? He said to his attendant, remove the eyes of this serpent, that is, do something that will cause the snake to leave. His attendant took a bit of water, threw it in the wine, and the snake turned away. This indicates that snakes do not drink partially diluted wine. But it could also mean that the snake recognized that somebody noticed it, and maybe some of the water went onto the snake too, and that was what caused the snake to move. But whatever, it was enough to teach a lesson that snakes don't like diluted wine.
I have a question.
Yes, Steve.
They seem to be obsessed with snakes here. Is that just because of the Adam and Eve thing, or?
Oh, no, that's an interesting homiletical point, but no, it was a very practical point. So remember, the rabbis are living in Israel and Babylonia, warm, almost desert-like climates where snakes and other wild creatures are in abundance. And in fact, there used to be lions that roamed the land of Israel too back at this time. So there's a lot of dangerous things in the environment, scorpions, other bugs, things like that, and vermin also, rats and mice. So the rabbis are practical here about food and the proper storage of food and beverages to ensure the health and safety of everybody in the community. So even though the beverage itself is kosher, diluted wine, cooked wine, water, all these things are kosher to drink, but the rabbis made it such that if you leave it exposed, then you're making it not kosher, because with it exposed, there's a danger that snakes could go in it, and the rabbis are saying better to create this new status of kashrut, which is not about whether the liquid itself is a kosher liquid or the food is a kosher food, but it's rather about the health of it. And that the rabbis are saying, no, you cannot eat this. The same thing, they do the same thing about not being allowed to have fish and meat on the same plate together. So there is a tradition. So if your custom is to have gefilte fish on Friday night, followed by chicken or meat, the tradition is that you're supposed to have a different utensil and a different plate. Like, in other words, you can't put your gefilte fish on the same plate as your chicken and meat, and you can't eat the gefilte fish with the same fork that you're going to eat the chicken and the meat. Why is that? The rabbi said because it's poisonous. Somehow the rabbis thought that fish and meat or chicken together is poisonous. And so it's not about whether gefilte fish is kosher or not, or the chicken is kosher or not, or the meat is kosher or not. It's this new status of the rabbis thinking of our health. So exposed beverages for our health to protect us from snakes, the rabbis say, not kosher. Fish and meat and chicken together on the same plate, not kosher because of health. Now, the fish, so like the rabbi said in the Middle Ages, the exposure to snakes is not an issue anymore. They have not said that about fish, meat, and chicken. So if you go to a kosher catered event, and there is, I don't know, some kind of fish that's being served as an appetizer, the caterer will ensure that there's a different plate for the next course, and there's a different fork that you're going to use as well, and different utensils to be used. So it's still a thing in the Orthodox world, this fish and chicken and meat and not being together. So Steve, long explanation that health, perceived health risk makes something in a status of being not kosher.
So that's different. These laws that are just based on health.
Yeah.
It's a bit different than everything else. It has some kind of religious tie in some sense, or, this is more practical.
Yes, but the practical health becomes a religious issue too. For the rabbis, they're saying, we want to make sure our community stays healthy, so we're going to institute this health measure and make it a religious measure. Right? So in other words, the way America works, you have the CDC coming out with health alerts, right? Or on cigarettes, it has the Surgeon General says this is bad for your health, and so you have that. This is like the rabbis becoming the Surgeon General and saying that these things are not kosher because of health. Yeah. Okay, so Rav Papa had said about, Rabba Bar Rav Huna said that diluted wine, he has the experience of being on the ship, sprinkling water onto the wine that made the snake go away from it. The Gemara is not accepting that. It says the Gemara rejects this conclusion. For undiluted wine, a snake will risk its life by exposing itself to humans, but for diluted wine, a snake will not risk its life. But in either case, if the wine is left unguarded, a snake will drink from it. So the Gemara is suggesting that if people are around, snakes will determine whether they'll risk its life or not for the chance of consuming that liquid. But if people aren't around, then snakes will drink anything. That's what the Gemara says. So the Gemara raises a difficulty. And is it true that for diluted wine, a snake will not risk its life? But wasn't Rabbi Yanai once in Bei Achbore? So we have a map, Bei Achbore. So on this map here, we see Tzfat. So we see the Sea of Galilee right here, and we see Tzfat up here, and Achbore is just south of Tzfat. So it's in the hills of the Galilee, okay? So wasn't Rabbi Yanai once in Beit Achbore? And some say that it was Bar Hadaya who was in Bei Achbore. doesn't, whether it's Yanai or Bar Hadaya, somebody was in Beach Borei, and others were sitting with him and drinking diluted wine. When they finished, they had some wine left in the container, and they covered it with a cloth. Okay, law of exposure. So you have to cover it so not to be subject to the law of exposure. And then they saw a certain snake take water in its mouth and pour it through the cloth into the container until the liquid filled the container and the wine flowed over the cloth, and the snake drank the overflowing wine. This shows that a snake will risk its life to drink diluted wine. Now, I don't know anything about snakes and what they drink, what they eat, but this story that a snake would take enough water in its mouth to put into the cup to make the water overflow so that it would drink it begs the question, it already has liquid in its mouth. Why does it need a different kind of liquid to put in its mouth? And did this story really happen? Well, apparently it did happen. They don't know which rabbi it was, but it happened in Beach Borei. So it's this fanciful story about what a snake will do to drink diluted wine. The sages say in response, wine that the snake itself diluted, it does not drink. Wine that another diluted, it does not drink. In other words, a snake does not drink diluted wine unless it was diluted by the snake itself. Accordingly, even partially diluted wine is not subject to the halacha of exposure. Rav Ashi says, and some say that was Rav Misharshia, who says, are you providing a resolution for a situation involving danger? In other words, one may not endanger lives by subscribing to such reasoning. Rava said the halacha is that diluted wine is subject to the halacha of exposure and is also subject to the prohibition of wine used as a libation for idolatry. Cooked wine is not subject to the halacha of exposure and is not subject to the prohibition of wine used for a libation either. Okay, so this concludes the section here about wine and non-Jews. So it's that libation part of it that is specifically related to our subject matter at hand. So in other words, the rabbis think that wine, non-Jews, pagans, idolaters, will make an offering with wine. And they will make an offering with diluted wine or regular wine, but they will not make the offering, the libation, with cooked wine. Okay, so that's why, like I had said last time, it's not just about whether the non-Jew will make a libation, it's also about drinking wine with non-Jews or wine that has been poured by non-Jews for Jews, because that could lead to social mixing and worse. So that's why at kosher catered events, kosher certified events, because cooked wine is not subject to the libation, it's also not subject to this thinking of socializing with non-Jews. That's why at a non-Jew who is who's the wait staff at a kosher catered event is allowed to pour mevushal wine for Jews, but not non-mevushal wine. So if someone insists to have kosher wine, but it doesn't say mevushal on it, the kosher caterer will not allow their wait staff to serve the non-mevushal wine, because that is still, according to Orthodox law, not allowed today. So just next time you're at a kosher catered event, take a look at the kosher wine there, and you'll see that it's mevushal because of this. Okay, so red S means on to a different topic. After discussing exposed wine, the Gemara addresses the matter of exposed water, right? So we're back to this idea of snakes and exposed water in general. The attendant of Rav Chilkiah bar Tovi noticed that a certain jug of water had become exposed and he had been sleeping near it. He went to Rav Chilkiah Bartovi to determine the halachic status of the exposed water. Rav Chilkiah said to him that the sages said, fear of a sleeping person is upon them. That is, snakes will not attempt to drink from a container that is near a person, even if he is asleep. And this matter applies only during the day, but not at night. The Gemara comments, but that is not so. Rather, there is no difference between one who sleeps during the day and one who sleeps during the night. In both cases, we do not say that the fear of a sleeping person is upon the snakes. So in other words, the rabbis are not sure. Do snakes avoid sleeping people? Do they avoid sleeping people only in the daytime but not at night? Do they not avoid sleeping people at all? So that's the discussion. The Gemara presents the opinions of Rav and Shmuel with regard to the various sources of water. Rav would not drink water from the house of an Aramean, as he said they are not careful with regard to exposure. But he would drink water from the house of a widow, as he said she upholds her late husband's conventions and ensures that liquids are not left uncovered. Right? So who can you trust about water not being exposed and not having, I think here, it might not be actually just about safety with a snake. It's also just about not having creepy crawlies in your food. So the idea is that a little creepy crawly that's found in your food, like why is it that, also I'll get back to kosher caterers again and kosher supervising agencies, why is it that some of them, this was an issue with my daughter's wedding a year and a half ago. We had the option of having a glot kosher wedding or just a kosher wedding, right? It's just the status of the meat there. Did it matter to us to be kosher or glot kosher? So it doesn't matter to me and not worth the extra expense for glot kosher. But glot kosher would have meant that we couldn't serve cauliflower and broccoli. So cauliflower and broccoli for glot kosher, for people who take an extra level of supervision there and care, applies to the checking of the bugs. How carefully are the broccoli and cauliflower rinsed to ensure that there are no bugs on them? Some people say this about strawberries too, that there are these little bugs found on strawberries, in the leaves of the strawberries themselves. So how careful is it enough just to cut off the end of the strawberry, or do you have to carefully rinse the entire strawberry before eating it? So that's the idea of bugs, that we're not supposed to consume bugs. Even inadvertently, and you're not going to drink a snake. That's clearly not the issue, but a snake that has been in the water, because snake is a creepy crawly. The name for that in Hebrew is sheretz. And we read about it yesterday in the Torah portion. Creepy crawlies are not allowed to be eaten, along with the categories of animals and fish and birds as well. If it has been in the water, it makes the water treif too. So not just about safety, but about the idea it's a creepy crawly there. So so widows are careful about exposed water, but Arameans are not. On to next. By contrast, so that's what Rav said, Shmuel would not drink water from the house of a widow. As he said, she no longer has the fear of a man upon her, and therefore she does not necessarily cover the water. But he would drink water from the house of an Aramean, as he said, granted that they're not particular about the halacha of exposure, but in any event, they are particular about cleanliness, and will cover it for hygienic reasons, if not halachic ones. The Gemara. So, in other words, Rav and Shmuel, rabbis of the same generation, the transition generation between the Mishnah and the Talmud, so we're talking about in the 200s, had different opinions about who you can trust. Can you trust an Aramean with because of their hygiene is good enough to ensure that water from them is okay? Can you trust a widow that they care about the extra um, laws about exposure of water? Um, so some say the Gemara cites a different version. Some say that Rav would not drink water from the house of an Aramean, but he would drink water from the house of a widow. Shmuel would not drink water either from the house of an Aramean or from the house of a widow. So it's unclear how this tradition got passed down and who said what about water regarding Arameans and widows. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says there are three kinds of wines that are not subject to the halacha of exposure, and they are sharp, bitter, and sweet wines. Sharp is referring to acrid wine that cracks the jug due to its acidity. Bitter is referring to yarneka, so that's just the specific name for that kind of wine in Aramaic. Sweet is referring to sweetened wine. These three wines that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says are not subject to the halacha of exposure are all of low quality. Rav Chama teaches that the three wines are of high quality. Sharp is referring to wine mixed with peppers. Bitter is referring to wine mixed with wormwood. Sweet is referring to May Barg, a choice beverage. So we have categories here in Aramaic or Greek or Hebrew that is related to a specific kind of wine, which we might not be familiar with anymore because we don't make wine like this anymore. But we have to remember that in the Middle East, especially in Israel, water wasn't readily available. Right? Not everybody had a well. Not everybody had lived close to a river in Israel, so it was hard to get water. So wine was what kept people alive, was the beverage that they drank. So they did different things to wine for different flavoring that is just not commonly done today anymore. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, Karina is not subject to the halacha of exposure. The Gemara asks, what is Karina? Rabbi Abahu said, it's sweet wine that comes from Asia Minor, so from Turkey. Sweet wine that comes from Turkey is called Karina. Rava says, but in its place of origin, it is subject to the halacha of exposure. What's the reason? The reason is that there it is the wine of the province, and snakes do not hesitate to drink from it. Rava said, with regard to this wine that has soured until 3 days have passed from when it began to sour, it's subject to the halacha of exposure and is subject to the prohibition of wine used for libation. So that's also another thing. If wine starts to sour, it's still, some people will still drink it, and you have 3 days to drink it, and it's also subject to these other prohibitions of libation and exposure. There's some language, just looking, that's, okay, so there's a note here about sweetened wine. Rashi explains that this is a low-quality wine prepared from grapes that were dried and sweetened by the sun. Oh, so it's raisins wine. It's indicated in the Jerusalem Talmud that in this context, the term sweet wine refers to wine that was cooked for the purpose of sweetening it. Okay, I think you can make wine from raisins. And let me just, there's some, here's the language. Okay, so they're just explaining these words here. Acrid wine, this term has a corollary or perhaps a source in the Arabic word which refers to sharp wines. Yarnaka, an alternative version of the text reads yarkona, which means vegetables. Some explain that according to that version, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is referring to wine mixed with certain vegetables that give it a bitter taste. Wormwood, from the Greek absinthian, a wine spiced with wormwood. This drink is still prepared nowadays and is known as absinthe. May Barg, some manuscripts and the Geonim have a different version of the text which reads May Badag, apparently deriving from the Middle Iranian Mai Badag, which means sweet wine. Karina, apparently from the Greek karoinon, a very sweet wine that is boiled in order to increase its concentration and sweetness. Asia, from the Greek Asia, which refers to a region known as Asia Minor. Additionally, Asia was the name of a Roman province located in this region. Apparently, these sages used this term in reference to a particular district somewhere in Asia Minor. Again, Turkey. It's what is Turkey today. That's Asia Minor. That has soured. The word de'akrim literally means that the item in question has developed a film over its outer layer. Some commentaries therefore explain that the Gemara is referring to soured wine on top of which a thin skin is formed. Other versions of the text read de'akris, which is possibly from the Latin term acris, meaning sour. Yet others suggest it's from the Greek oxos, which also refers to a sour substance. Okay, so just this language here that is maintained in the text from generation to generation. Remember, we're talking about manuscripts of Talmud that have been maintained by the scribe, and they could, when it's an unusual word, the scribe may have changed it along the way to make it something that is more familiar. So we're not exactly sure what the original word was. So that's why we have these different possibilities listed below. Okay, so on to the next paragraph. From this point forward, it's not subject to the halacha of exposure, and it's not subject to the prohibition of wine used for a libation. That is 3 days after the wine sours. And the sages of Nehardea, major community in Babylonia, say, even after 3 days, we're concerned with regard to exposure. What is the reason? It's because at times it occurs that a snake drinks even sour wine. Okay. The Gemara discusses the halacha of exposure with regard to various foods and beverages. Okay, so now we're getting to the topic of exposure itself. The sages taught wine that is still fermenting is not subject to the halacha of exposure. And how long is its fermentation process? It's 3 days. So that I have no idea. I don't know how long it takes to make wine. Today, I've done tours of wineries, and I haven't really paid attention when the person says how long the grape juice stays in the vat in order to become wine, and how much longer it has to stay in there based on the quality of the wine. I don't know. Cress-based dishes are not subject to the halacha of exposure, but the residents of the diaspora are accustomed to treating them as prohibited if they were left exposed. And we said this only in a case where the dishes do not contain vinegar. But if they do contain vinegar, the vinegar repels the snakes. And in such a situation, even the inhabitants of the diaspora do not treat them as prohibited. Right? So different foods in different places could determine whether they are subject to the law of exposure or not. The Gemara continues, Babylonian kutach, a popular dip, is not subject to the halacha of exposure, but the residents of the diaspora are accustomed to treating it as prohibited. I just want to take a look at the note for a second, just to see what it means by diaspora. Elsewhere, the Gemara explains that the phrase, the residents of the diaspora, is a reference to Rabbi Chia and his sons. These sages ascended from Babylonia to Eretz Yisrael and were among the greatest scholars of their generation. Okay, so the people of the diaspora are specifically these people who came from Babylonia as part of Rabbi Chia's group back in the land of Israel. So different traditions about food based on where people are coming from. So the question is about this popular dip, kutach. Let's see if there's a note here about what kutach is. Um, yeah, kutach was a commonly prepared dip in Babylonia, often eaten as an appetizer. It was made from whey, salt, and bread fermented to the point of moldiness, with the occasional addition of other spices. Doesn't sound appetizing to me, but okay, that's what it was. Um, Rav Menashe said, if the kutach has indentations in it, we are concerned that they are from a snake's fangs, and it's therefore prohibited. Rav Chia Bar Ashi says that Shmuel says dripping water is not subject to the halacha of exposure while it's being collected. Rav Ashi said, and that is the halacha only in a case where the dripping occurs one drop immediately after another drop, that is continuously, as the snake will not drink from it in that circumstance. Right? So again, it also, we have different standards today of how long you're going to leave food out for, right? People, they didn't have refrigerators then. So where are you keeping your food? Where are you keeping this kutach? Where are you keeping other beverages? And you keep them in vats or pots or jugs in your house, just laying around. And so that's why things could get inside that we wouldn't even think about happening today. Okay. Rav Chia Bar Ashi says that Shmuel says the mouth of a fig is not subject to the halacha of exposure. In accordance with whose opinion is this stated? It's stated in accordance with the opinion of this Tana, as it's taught in a Braita that Rabbi Eliezer said, a person may eat grapes and figs at night, and he need not have cause for concern. As it is stated, the Lord preserves the simple. This verse teaches that one need not fear that harm might befall him when he engages in commonplace activities. Right? If you're eating a snack at night, don't worry about the grapes and figs and what might be mixed in with it. Right. So here, we have a note about the mouth of a fig. Some commentaries explain that there's no concern that a snake might have licked the juices found inside a fruit. The reason for this leniency is that these juices are not exposed. Rashi states that the mouth of a fig is the fig's pedicel after it has been plucked from the branch. Others write that it refers to the lower part of the fig, which develops a small slit as it ripens on the tree. Either way, the Gemara is teaching that one need not be concerned with regard to exposure, even if a fruit contains a small opening through which a snake's venom could theoretically pass. Nevertheless, if there's an indication that the fruit was pierced by a snake's fangs, it may not be eaten. Okay, so it has to have obvious proof that a snake has touched it before it makes it not kosher to consume. Rav Safra says in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua Deroma, there are three kinds of snake venom. Venom of a young snake, which sinks to the bottom when it's deposited in liquid. Venom of a snake of intermediate age, that is a snake that is no longer young, which is suspended in the liquid. And venom of an old snake, which floats at the top. The Gemara asks, is this to say that as a snake ages, the strength of its venom becomes weaker? But isn't it taught in a Baraita that three creatures become stronger as they age, and they are a fish, a snake, and a pig? The Gemara answers, it is physically that a snake strengthens, but the potency of its venom diminishes. The Gemara asks, with regard to what halacha was it stated that the venom of a young snake sinks? The Gemara explains, as it's taught in a Baraita with regard to a barrel that was uncovered, even though 9 people drank from it and did not die, the 10th should not drink from it, as the venom may have sunk to the bottom of the barrel. The Gemara relates that there was an incident in which 9 people drank from an exposed barrel and did not die, and a 10th subsequently drank from it and died. Rabbi Yirmiyah says this is an example of venom that sinks. Okay, so a story that proves why we should not be drinking, even if other people drank from it and were fine, we should not drink from exposed barrels. And similarly, with regard to a melon that was exposed, even though 9 people ate from it and did not die, the 10th should not eat from it. Again, there was an incident in which 9 people ate from a melon and did not die, and a 10th ate from it and died. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi says this is an example of venom that sinks. The sages taught with regard to water that was exposed, one may not pour it out in the public thoroughfare, nor settle dust with it by sprinkling it in the house, nor mix clay with it, nor give it to drink to his animal or the animal of another, nor wash his face, hands, or feet with it. Others say if the part that one is washing is an area of the body that has a crevice in it, it is prohibited to wash it with exposed water, as the venom may seep through the crevice. If the body part does not have a crevice, it is permitted. Right? So you can't even use exposed water for these other purposes because the venom may still have potency in that way.
So this seems like snakes were all over the place if they're really this concerned about them. I mean, was that what was going on in this part of the world?
Right. It was absolutely. I have to I'm trying to get rid of a pop-up thing that's coming up on my screen, and I don't know if you can see it, but okay. Yes, so this is clearly the rabbis are talking about examples that are real life situations, and they've experienced people dying because of the actual fact that venom was found in the water. Okay, so it's 10:20, so let's stop here for today, and we'll see everybody next week, and have a good rest of the day and a good week, everybody.
You too. Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.